You who are joining us, thank you for joining us. We will get started at 6 o'clock. If you open up the chat,
3 o'clock Pacific time.
3 o'clock, excuse me, I'm on the East Coast. If you open up the chat, you'll see that my colleague Neil is linking the home base Google document there. And if you're inclined to open that up and find the slides, and we will be sharing the screen, but you'll have access to it there. Also, thanks to Anthony for being here. He is going to be captioning live, so feel free to turn on those live captions in your toolbar at the bottom of your screen in your Zoom toolbar. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. If you open up the chat, you'll see links to the slides and to a Google document that has all of the resources and information you could need about this webinar series and the slides for this afternoon. Also, feel free to turn on the live captions if you're inclined to do so. And thank you to Anthony for being here to caption this session. This is a recorded session, and we will begin right about 3 o'clock. Looks like maybe, Neil, if you just want to check the access. Okay, we're all set. Someone said they couldn't access the link.
Those links are posted again, so just let us know if you're having trouble getting into the documents.
Situation resolved, Neil? Yes? Okay, good.
Yeah, it looks like we're coming through. Thanks, Susie. Thanks, May.
So welcome everybody. We'll get started in a few minutes. I'm sorry if you've heard me say this a couple of times already, but for those of you who are just joining us, you'll find links to the slides and to a Google document in the Zoom chat. If you open that up on the bottom of your screen in the Zoom toolbar. Also, we're fortunate to have Anthony here tonight, who is live captioning this session. So feel free to turn on those closed captions if you would like to have them during today's webinar. Also, this is a recorded session, just so you know, and the link to the recording will be in a couple of days after we have access to it. We'll put it in the Google Doc, so you'll have access to that as well. Nice to see you, Fred. Thank you. I think we'll wait just a couple of minutes. I know we had a number of people registered So we'll wait just about 2 more minutes. Feel free to grab a cup of tea or something if you want to, and we'll start in about 2 minutes. Okay, I think we'll get started. So, a big welcome to everybody who's joining us. Thank you for attending this and maybe other sessions of our webinar series about hybrid literacy learning. It's something that's been on our minds a lot in New Hampshire. I know in the schools that I support there, CAST has a big project in New Hampshire. And I know that it's happening on the other side of the country too, right? We're thinking a lot about literacy instruction when kids are in school sometimes and not in school sometimes, and we're designing in all kinds of contexts. Tonight's session is about accessibility, and I'm really thrilled to be introducing you to my colleague Janet Peters. Janet is a colleague at CAST who works on our accessibility and education, the AIM Center, the Accessible Educational Materials. CAST runs the National AIM Center, and Janet works on projects that operate out of that arm of our organization. When I first came to CAST and I first started teaching about universal design for learning, I have to admit that it felt like sometimes what I used to say was like all of this great stuff about UDL and then kind of a tagline like, and also make sure it's all accessible, right? It was sort of this thing, and Janet and I started to do some work together where we really wove accessibility into all of the ways that we think about learning design, all of the ways that we think about the variability of our learners, all of the ways we think about assessment and goal setting and methods and materials, the whole of the curriculum. So it's really wonderful to facilitate with Janet or with anybody who has that knowledge base about really making sure that the learning that we're offering to learners is accessible. You'll also recognize my colleague Niel Albero. If you came to the last session or if you just know UDL or CAST in general, Niel has been out to California a lot, probably to some of your schools. And tonight Niel is going to be the man behind the chat. So he'll be in the chat box making sure you have all the right links, as well as our colleague Jennifer Levine, and she's also going to be watching and responding and thinking with you in the chat. Again, please feel free to turn on the live captions if you need them, and if you need a link to something, please let us know. This is a recorded session, I should let you know that. So we're going to start off with just a quotation, and it's from an old colleague of mine, probably 30 years of working together in different contexts, started off in inclusive education, working now on universal design and working with teachers, Michael McSheehan. And in the conversation one time, early in Michael's thinking about universal design for learning, he said, oh, it's like instead of asking if the learner is ready for the lesson, UDL asks if the lesson is ready for the learner, right? So that way in which we used to deny some learners access to some learning because we felt like they didn't have the readiness, the prerequisite skills to be able to be eligible for that learning. UDL really says what we're really talking about with literacy instruction that works for everybody is let's think about is the lesson ready for the learners, right? For each and every learner. part of what being ready means is being accessible. So if you're listening today and you have a background in universal design for learning, I invite you to bring that here now. And if you're listening today and you don't have a background in universal design for learning, these questions, I hope, are just as meaningful for you. When we think about the accessibility of any lesson, I'm going to use a hybrid literacy lesson as our example tonight, this afternoon. We can ask about the ways that learners are engaged in the lesson, the way that they become interested, the way that they sustain effort and persistence, the way that they self-regulate. And we can ask ourselves, are the options for engagement, for doing those things, accessible for all learners? And when we think about a lesson and we think about all of the content, all of the materials and resources that we're going to use in that lesson, we can ask ourselves, are the options or all of the choices that we're giving to learners for the materials and the resources and the stuff that they're going to use in that lesson, is it accessible for all learners? And then finally, when we think about what learners are going to kind of do and say while they're learning, how they're going to act upon learning, how they're going to communicate, how they're going to organize and set goals and plan their learning, demonstrate their understanding, are the options for communication and assessment that we're designing into that lesson accessible for all learners? Accessibility, and this is sort of the big idea of this whole webinar this afternoon, accessibility is a necessary consideration for all learning design. The goals for this afternoon's session are just to kind of ground ourselves once again and remember and understand that the barriers to learning are not in learners, but they're in the design, they're in the curriculum, they're in the methods, materials, the assessments we design that sometimes prevent learners or delay learners from reaching the goal. We also want to support you to build your capacity to consider the accessibility of literacy materials. And as much as your capacity, we want to support you to build your habit. That habit of mind is, as I'm designing, I'm considering accessibility. And then finally, just to really recognize, we talked in the first webinar, and I should note that that recording is linked in that Google Doc that's in that you have access to if you missed it and you want to go back. But we talked a lot about this concept of expert learning, learners being really good at learning, learners who make every single learning experience an opportunity to learn something about themselves as learners. And to understand that when we provide learning designs that are not accessible for learners, we really are cutting them off from the opportunity to become better at learning itself. If I can't access the learning, not only can I not get the biology content, but I'm also cut off from the opportunity to become a more expert learner. So we're going to start right off by sort of assessing together and using the chat in Zoom to either put your ideas, or just if you're in a place where you're not inclined to do lots of public writing, you could just be watching the chat. That's fun to do too, so up to you. But just looking at this sample hybrid literacy lesson, we're going to think a little bit about, is it accessible? Why or why not? So you'll be able to put in the chat your thoughts, like, I think this is not accessible, or it is accessible. So because the font is a little bit small, I'm going to just read through this lesson and explain it to you. It's hybrid in the sense that part of the instruction is happening in a brick and mortar school, and part of the instruction is happening virtually in a remote instruction model. So the goal the teacher has is that students will use evidence from a text to support an argument or thesis. And here's sort of the thumbnail sketch of the lesson. The teacher explains this paper and plastic assignment using Zoom, and students turn on their microphones and cameras to ask questions about it. So the teacher is going to just give the big picture of this assignment called Paper or Plastic. It's about something with science. Then students are going to independently read a 20-page chapter in their paper copy science textbook, they have those at home, about the environmental impact of both paper and plastic grocery bags. So the content is going to be in that paper hard copy textbook that learners have at their homes, wherever they're learning from. Then the class is going to consider key elements of the text and have small group discussions in Zoom breakout rooms about which type of bag is the better environmental choice. The teacher will facilitate that a little bit so that learners can be using that content knowledge to have a discussion and kind of comparing and contrasting the pros and cons of paper bags in the grocery store or plastic bags. And then finally, independently, students will choose a position. I think paper bags, and independently write their argument in a 5-paragraph essay using evidence from the text. So here we are. Take a moment. We'll take 3 minutes. Is this accessible? What about this is accessible? What about this is inaccessible? And share any thoughts and ideas you have. So again, watch the chat, contribute to the chat, or both. I should add that as you're posting in the chat, please select all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see what people are posting. Some great ideas coming in. We'll take about 1 more minute. Thanks for all of those great observations and questions about the design of this lesson. I know for me, sometimes when I'm learning something new, it's really helpful to have some context to apply it to. So some of you may be designing a hybrid literacy lesson for tomorrow morning, right? And you have plenty of context. Others may want to use this silly little paper or plastic lesson as you listen this afternoon and you're hearing ideas about tools and technologies. How might those tools and technologies that you hear Janet talking about later shortly help this paper or plastic lesson to be more accessible? Okay, moving on. So you'll notice throughout this afternoon that there'll be these slides with somewhat of sort of summary statements, and we've organized the content to deliver some of these sort of takeaways right up front. So the first is that considering accessibility reduces barriers in design. We really want to emphasize that the barrier in learning is in the design and not the learner. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where that concept comes from, and then I'm going to turn things over to Janet to talk about accessibility in learning design. So here's that concept. The barrier is in the environment, not the learner. It comes from the field of architecture. Universal design in architecture is an approach to design that works to ensure that the products and buildings can be used by virtually anyone, regardless of the level of ability or disability. So people think ahead of time about how all people might get into that space or use that space. It's not an afterthought, but it's part of the original blueprint. Universal design is not retrofitting, right? This image on the far left is a blue door at the top of a set of stairs into a brick building. And the arrow points to a little sign, and the image in the middle is that sign enlarged. And I'm going to read what that sign says. It says, "Disabled person's entrance at the rear of the building." And the image on the far right is the picture of the rear of this brick building with a concrete ramp with some sort of a wire fencing around up and down it, a zigzag ramp. That was added sort of after the building was designed, right? It wasn't part of the original blueprint for this building. It was more of that afterthought, like, oh my gosh, we've got people who need to enter this building who use wheelchairs, right? People who need to enter this building who have babies in strollers, people who need to use this building who may have just had ankle surgery and may not be able to go up the set of stairs. Lots and lots of reasons, so it's an afterthought. We call that kind of retrofitting for access. That's not accessibility that we lead with, that's accessibility that we kind of do at the backside. This is a different image, and this is an image of a space that was designed with everybody in mind from the beginning. It wasn't an afterthought to put in a ramp. It wasn't an afterthought to put in handrails. This was a space that was designed thinking universally about the use of this space right at the get-go. So you can think, or you can put it in the chat, or just think quietly about who might use the ramp in this building. Why the handrails might be important. And absolutely for sure, there's no right answer and there's no one answer here, right? Lots of people might use that ramp. There might be lots of reasons for use of those handrails. And who else might benefit from this design other than the people that you might be thinking of right away? So I'll just give you maybe 1 minute to either think reflectively in your own mind if you're an introvert and you're just done with the chat for a minute, or if you'd like to put some thoughts in the chat. The questions are on the screen. You can just answer those. I invite you to keep this image in your mind as you think about lesson design, because what if our lessons, right? What if our academic curricular lessons looked like this image? What if they were as forward thinking and anticipatory as this space is, this physical space, and all the ways that we proactively anticipate the variability of the people who use the space, and in our lessons, the people who are going to learn about paper or plastic, or they're going to learn anything that we might be teaching. And keep those ideas coming in. We'll move ahead. So we think about universal design, and I love this adage, what's necessary for some is good for all. Neil and I were doing a webinar this morning for some folks who talked about how the automatic doors have been really useful during this pandemic, something that nobody ever anticipated, but that the automatic doors have had this other use. So universal design good examples of it are stuff that we see in our everyday lives, like curb cuts and easy grip tools and closed captioning, and things that maybe came into the world because they were necessary for some, are good for all. We're not going to spend time right now writing down in the chat, what are all the wonderful ways you use curb cuts or easy grip tools or closed captioning or automatic doors? But certainly there are lots of people using them for lots of different, lots of ways. So we're going to take a moment. We're going to do this a few times throughout the afternoon, throughout this 1 hour, for any questions, stories, or ideas. We won't spend too much time, maybe just 2 minutes or so when we take these pauses. But if you're inclined to stick something in the chat, a connection, maybe a resource, maybe an article that you just read, certainly the learning today will come as much from you all as it will come hopefully from us. You also, actually, I don't know, is it possible for people to turn on their microphone and camera in this webinar model?
No, it's not, Susan. Sorry.
Okay, so it's not possible. I apologize. That's my mistake. So feel free to put something in the chat if you'd like to share it. This reminds me of, or a connection I have, or a question I have that's emerging, and Neil and Jennifer will try to find ways to answer those questions or link you to resources. And we'll just move on. So this is where I'm going to pass the baton to Janet and ask her to help us understand a little bit about the role of assistive technology in universally designed spaces. I can remember back in the old days of inclusive education, sometimes when we didn't quite get it right, we thought, well, if the student, goes into a general education classroom, he no longer needs his paraprofessional, or he no longer needs those modifications, or he no longer needs those related services. And of course, that student does need those things still, right? Just being in a general education classroom doesn't take away the need for those supports and accommodations, those services, etc. It's also true that even in universally designed spaces, learners still need their assistive technology. And so I'm going to pass the things to Janet now to help us understand that a little bit more deeply. Thank you, Janet.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And you may or may not be familiar with assistive technology, but the whole technology ecosystem can get a little confusing with all the terminology. So assistive technology is, just like Susan said, it belongs to the individual, and it's any piece of equipment or item, whether it's a specialized product that is considered, rehab technology or something just for people with disabilities, or even if it's mainstream technology, but it's used by a person with a disability. So the important thing is that it's technology or services that support an individual to improve or maintain or increase their functional capabilities for an individual with a disability. Some examples, I just have some cartoon things in this graphic that might give you some examples of things that might be considered assistive technology. That might be a visual organizing tool, a way to have communication done digitally that's an augmentative or alternative communication device. Dictation, where you can talk into the computer and it turns your voice into speech for text, so instead of writing. So there's all kinds of assistive technology, especially for literacy, that would help in the process of reading and writing, that would do exactly what the definition of AT says, of increasing, maintaining, or improving the functional capabilities of a person with a disability. Where the confusion comes in, so if we go back to this slide, you'll see a few things in here that are just we consider educational tools, mind mapping, built-in accessibility, maybe a note taker, study skills, support or aids. Some of these things are used by all the students. So one of the things that I work on in my project at CAST is what exactly is the difference between instructional technology and assistive technology. And this graphic on this slide helps us understand what those terms mean. So assistive technology, when it was first introduced, when the personal computer became widely available and used in schools, early 80s, 90s time, assistive technology was really a very separate, a separate type of technology than instructional technology. You had assistive technology specialists and educational technology specialists, and they worked pretty separately. You started in the early 2000s to see a convergence of how assistive technology and instructional technology started to kind of bleed at the edges in that middle section in this, I don't know how to use the tools, maybe my pointer. Oh, there we go. Maybe that's working. In this middle section. So there was some overlap. I think of things like text to speech, where drag and dictate used to be used as a piece of assistive technology. And when I first started in assistive technology in the 90s, we got a grant to train students with disabilities on how to dictate using speech to text. That software piece cost $25,000, one program, so one student could use it. We now know that we all talk into our phone, or you can hit the microphone on Google, and that's an example of speech to text, where that turns that into text. So that's the technology convergence. If we look into, 2010, we see that widening, so that more things are general education technology, and assistive technology, it's still used by individuals with disabilities, but now it's more widespread, mainstream within the school. And today, I would say that you have a vast majority of educational technology that is available and usable to everyone, and a much more specialized set of technologies on either end of that spectrum. But what's important to remember about that is that assistive technology, even though many of things that would have been considered only assistive technology in the 1990s are now education technology, that assistive technology still has a legal grounding for students who have IEPs or 504s. And so if a student uses something like text to speech, Read and Write Gold is an example of a text to speech program. If they use, or a text to speech, something that will read the text to you. If a student needs that assistive technology, it goes back to the concept of universal design. That's necessary for them. Might be good for all of the students in the class, but if a student with assistive technology needs that, it comes with them as assistive technology. So in other words, there's no longer a list of what would be considered assistive technology and a list of what would be considered information or, instructional or education technology. It really depends on who is using that technology. And even if you create things to be universal design, which you should, because it's more usable and flexible to a greater amount of people, individuals who need assistive technology may still need to bring that assistive technology to that digital space. So for example, you can create a universally designed document or web page that does not need, that is accessible, but the individual who is blind using a screen reader would still need to use their assistive technology to access that material. So assistive technologies for the individual, it's about overcoming their barriers and personalized to their needs. Universal design is the environment that you want to create as accessibly as possible so that it's not retrofitted and has built-in flexibility. So I feel like I talk really fast compared to Susan, who has such a nice pace, but I thought we would stop and just Does that concept make sense to people? There is a lot of confusion out there that there's a special list of assistive technology. We hear things like educational technology or assistive technology and see a list of programs. But really, the only thing that makes assistive technology its own thing is if it is written into the IEP as a support for a student with disability. And we recommend that you do that even if that same technology is available to everyone in the classroom. And we really saw through the pandemic when schools had to close that when that assistive technology was not considered and really thought about for the student with a disability, many needs went unmet because they did not have their assistive technology needs in whatever new environment they were learning and doing literacy, having literacy instruction in. So it's really important that a person has what they need, but also that the environment supports that flexibility for everyone to be able to use what they need in that.
So feel free to put anything in the chat related to assistive technology that you know about in your state and in the world. Any questions that you have that are coming up now or later. And again, I apologize that I gave you the option of turning your microphone on and you can't do that. But we can probably move forward. And if Neil or Jennifer, you see a question pop up that you think might be good for Janet to address, feel free to let us know.
And there are many resources, and I know that some of them are in the home space document that is created for you, but you also have in the slide deck, as Susan said, you have our contact information. So that is one of the things we do is answer technical questions about accessible technology, assistive technology. And so I'm not getting into demonstrations and very product specific. I can't help but throw a few products out there because that's how I think about them. But know that you can reach out to us and ask any questions about more specific information. So in the next section, we want to consider accessibility in this broader framework of hybrid literacy and know that this is a habit of thinking about how you design your instruction and your literacy instruction and your literacy materials. And so it's a good habit. It's one of those habits where you really want to think about the accessibility and the usability for your students. One way to do that is to use what is kind of an overarching theme for accessibility that can be applied to many different technology mediums, and that's the POUR framework. It comes from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and those are a set of guidelines that guide digital accessibility. It goes beyond web, but it started specifically with developing a website. They're very technical guidelines. So if you Google Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I think we're at 2.2 now, you will get very technical and specific information. And sometimes it's too technical for an educational setting, for a teacher making a document, for thinking about literacy in the hybrid setting. But this POUR acronym really takes the core principal concepts of the very technical nature of accessibility and says, what do you really have to think about when you design? So when you design to overcome those barriers, you need to have perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And if you're grounded into thinking about that in your design, then you will make most of your accessibility materials accessible. So when you apply this to literacy, perceivable means make sure that your learners can see and hear your content. Very straightforward, but if you have, I love the paper plastic lesson plan, because if you have a textbook and that is a physical textbook and that's the only way a student can get that content, they have no options to hear or see that a different way. So you want to really think about the perceivability for all students. And by making sure that a student who, for example, is blind has a digital copy or a digital access to a document, and that's available to other students, we can see that necessary for some, but actually good for many students who may not have those specialized of needs. Operable, make sure learners can interact with your content with a variety of tools and ways. Most often in the digital space, this means that you can work with something with the keyboard and not just mouse operations. Most assistive technology uses keyboard commands to use specialized keyboards. So making sure that things are operable to work with your content in interactive way, in multiple ways. Understandable, make sure your learners can understand your content. So it's at their language level, in their language that they can understand, scaffolded and designed to be an enjoyable and predictable experience for them. Understandable is somewhat subjective, but when you go and start really thinking about the end user's experience, it helps you understand what makes that an experience they can get meaning from. And then finally, robust. Make sure your content works well with the current and future technologies. We also saw counter examples in the COVID-19 crisis. I work with districts across the nation. Several districts had technology for students. Google, one particular example, had issued Google Chromebooks to all of their students, which was admirable. And those Google Chromebooks in the school context work just fine because they would be used for maybe 20 minutes at a time to do the assignment. Under 8 hours of constant use a day by these students trying to do very high-end Zoom interactions and interactive websites, it turned out that the technology was not robust enough to work with the system. So robust really means making sure that what you're doing works with the current situation and will be interoperable with future technologies. I'm going to just pause for a second and make sure there's anyone jump in if there's no questions. Has anyone heard of POUR before who's in this webinar as an overarching framework for accessibility?
I'll watch the chat and let you know.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I will put a plug in for the National AIM Center. I mean, most of this material is from our National AIM Center, and they have some really good resources there for you that I encourage you to explore. But one of them is designing with POUR, and you can look into that concept I just touched on and really get that to what does a teacher do in a classroom to make sure that their materials that they're creating for their students fit, that POUR, that they are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Okay, so, well, I see Fred. Sorry, I glanced out. Hi, Fred. I had a meeting with Cynthia. She said to tell you hi. So let's move on to how you would actually do this in what are some of the actual technologies you could use to, say, personalize the reading experience or support the writing experience. Right within the technology, there are many built-in accessibility features. Again, borrowing on that concept of universal design, these are free features that can be used by any student, any teacher, to make the reading and writing experience more predictable and usable for them. So within any operating system, whether you're on a Mac platform, a Google Chromebook, or a Windows machine, you can adjust the size and the color and actually a great deal of the visual information on your display. If you've never taken the time to go to your operating system and look at those built-in accessibility features for resizing the icons or customizing the mouse cursor, these are great tools that you can use with your parents. I showed my dad how to do this. I'm not 100% sure it stuck, but these are tools that might make your own. We're all spending so much more time in this digital space that also give yourself a break. If you need inverted colors or you're getting eye fatigue from so much Zoom, there are things built in that are free in your operating system to make the visual settings better and a more personalized experience. And I will give people, you really can't break anything. So know that you can go in there and you can always hit a reset button to get it back to what the normal setting is. So to feel confident to look around and play. And give your students this power. Give your students the power to know that they can control what their visual settings might look like. You can increase the pointer size. This is a very simple feature that is very powerful for students, both to focus attention, but also for visual help. You can magnify the screen. All the systems, and when I say that, I mean all the operating systems that are out there have really pretty robust free magnifying options that you can magnify within the screen. You can magnify the whole screen. You can invert the colors. You can make the edges softer so that you can highlight and see things, smoothing the images out. You can really personalize that without spending the money you used to spend in those assistive technology products. Now, that said, if the built-in tools do not work for a student, there are still commercial software available that's more robust. And so many times assistive technology, if the built-in options aren't working, that's what you can use these as testing tools and then move to commercial products that have more options. Color filters are a way to change the color if you have color blindness or light sensitivity or even just a visual preference. And so you can use the color filters and customize your screen to what works from you with the color filters. We're talking about hybrid literacy today, this afternoon. And so we would be remiss if we didn't mention that videos in the concept of universal design for learning and offering multiple means of representation and the POUR framework that makes things perceivable to be accessible. Videos are a great way to promote literacy if you use the captioning feature within a video. So you can create videos you can create captions for your own videos. On the National AIM Center, we have a ton of resources on how to specifically do that on YouTube or using Amara, which is a free editing tool. So if you're doing user-generated content that has videos that you are sharing with your students, hooray, that's a great engagement tool for students to be able to perceive content. But if you don't have the captioning, you may be creating a barrier for students who need that captioning in order they have a hearing loss and they can't hear it, or other disability that would prevent them. But you're also missing an opportunity for all the students. Every student should know that in videos, they can turn the captioning on and off, and they can change how that captioning looks on their screen to them so that they can raise the font. You can do that here in Zoom. If you're using the closed captioning right now, or that Anthony is doing for us, you can change how that looks. This is a great empowerment tool for students in literacy. And we know that literacy exposure for students learning English, for students to develop stronger reading skills, is really powerful. So remember videos and remember captioning when you think about literacy.
As a former first grade teacher, I can think about how wonderful it would have been to just know that every single thing that was spoken, right, was right there for learners to see in print. You know, we used to go around in the old days and label every single thing in our classroom so learners would see the printed word. So opportunities just to support decoding development and a skill development as well. So I see that Niel put something in the chat about creating quality video. Any other resources that you have to share or questions that are coming up, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Okay, we'll give people a second, and my wonderful co-pilots are monitoring the chat because it's over here. So if I'm looking away, that's my desire to see what you're all chatting. So expert literacy learners know how to personalize their reading and writing experience, their reading and writing experiences. And we just talked a little bit about how those universal design features are just built into all of our systems. I want to talk a little bit right now about how you as the educator can make sure that what you create is accessible for students so that they are able to use those tools to personalize their experience. We use a acronym at the National AIMS Center that's called SLIDE, and it's an easy acronym. Someone like POUR gets down to the nitty gritty. So POUR is the big concept, and then SLIDE just helps you every time you create a document to think about the styles. So how the document is styled, because that is how assistive technology interacts. What are the section headings? The links, are they meaningful and have descriptions? Images, again, perceivable. Do those images have text descriptions that go with them? Design, thinking about the design. I know we're not asking the first grade teacher to be a design expert, but we do ask them to think about their end user and what's perceivable to them. Is there color contrast? Is there enough white space to do that? And then really thinking about evaluation. So going through the steps that make something accessible, and then taking a reflective approach to say, is this actually work for the user? And the best way to do that is ask them. If you know a student using assistive technology and you've created a worksheet, and you think it's accessible, this is where education is a partnership, and you work with the end user to make sure that works for you. So I'm going to go through this SLIDE acronym fairly quickly, but just so you have an idea of what these mean. So within any kind of word processor where you create a document, you have a level of heading structures. Using the built-in way to create a document. So if you imagine a Word document and there's a place on the top menu bar where you can say styles, and you make something a heading 1, like the red here in our right-hand side of this video of a document, you'll see the heading 1, and then these are heading 2s, the subpoints under that. Visually, that can look however you want it to look. But we know as a sighted user, we usually see the top, and then we see sections, and we can skip around. What using styles does is allows someone who uses assistive technology to scroll through these, also have an overview. So if you use a screen reader that can give you a list of these headings and let you jump from heading to heading, you have a similar or more pleasant experience being able to scan the document just like a sighted user would do. The nice thing about all accessibility is that if you use the built-in features and you use accessibility in your design, so that's you design your materials accessible, be that a website or a document, they're much easier to maintain. That's the secret. Doing this will let you change how all heading 2 levels look with one click. You just change what heading 2 is. But if you have each paragraph individually labeled, you have to go through the document and change those. And so it's more usable, it's more maintainable by you, as well as more usable by individuals with assistive technology. Using links, if you use links within your documents to make sure that those links have a clear description of where a person is going to go. Imagining that when you are using a screen reader, you get to a link, that you should be able to know if you click on it, what information you're having. One thing that is less common, but used to be really common with people using hyperlinks within documents or within websites is the same name on all links, like click here or more info, and having more info 3 times. So assistive technology can pull up all the links from a document, but if they all have the same label, it's really hard for an end user to know where they're going, because listening to that HTML URL is really difficult. If you use images in a document, make sure that you add alt text, which just is a way to add a description to any kind of image that you have. This is good for individuals, again, using assistive technology, but it's also a really good practice in design. It makes you think about, if I can't think of a description for this image that I'm giving my students to learn about something, it begs the question, is that image help with the understanding, or why am I using that image? It doesn't mean you shouldn't use images. Images are a great way to convey information and provide a way for students to gain understanding. But those images should be really intentional, and alt text helps us as educators and designers to be very intentional with what we're using and saying. And then it gives students a way, if you teach your students to look at the alt text, if they don't understand what this image of the UDL guidelines, which is a very dense, packed image, what that is, an alt text will help ground that person, whether or not they are using assistive technology. Again, good for all, necessary for some. So if you use assistive technology, you definitely need to have those alt text available to you. We've talked a little bit about design. Some of that is color contrast. There is a specific technical ratio you use. I don't think you need to worry about that. Go to the National AIM site. There are free tools where you can just put in your colors and pick them. You don't even know, on this slide, we see the hexadecimal. You don't need to know any of that. You just pick one color and pick your second color and say, does this have enough contrast to meet accessibility standards? And remembering that the reason we're meeting accessibility standards is that makes it more usable and lowers the barriers for all the students in the class. And then finally, if you're not familiar, most tools, Google Docs has a program called Grackle, where you can check the accessibility of your document and gives you a high-level report. It's a first step. There are always going to be things that you need to manually check, or is your alt text actually correct? A computer can tell you if alt text is there or not, but you need to be able to look at that. Microsoft Word has a built-in accessibility checker in their Word document. And this is a good, again, as we talked about, it's just a practice and a habit to do these steps and then check it for accessibility, and then get feedback from your end users as a process of design and creation. And then we wanted to mention technology supports for writing too. Writing is a very complex, it's a very complex skill. There are physical skills as well as cognitive skills that go with that, but there are many technology supports that support writing. Some are in that convergence bubble. If we remember back to the slide where I showed things that used to be AT, an example is like concept mapping that used to be used for students with disabilities, that's now more widely used. Visual organizing like Wakelet or sketch drawing, like paper. There are many tools to help brainstorm and get ideas, as well as tools to actually support, pencil grips and low tech things that would help a person with any OT type of issues. On the writing drafting side, there are tools like word prediction or text to speech that we've talked about, and tools that could be used and are used by many students, but might be specifically necessary as assistive technology for some students. And that was I just did a brain dump on you. And so thank you for hanging with me, everyone. And to give you an overview of technology for literacy, hopefully you walked away with understanding what assistive technology is versus just general tech, and then where accessible educational materials and accessible technology fits into this concept.
Janet, one question that came up in the chat, which may be specific and something you can take offline later, but it's about, does anybody know of a program that will read SNP, S-N-I-P? Are you familiar with that, or is that something we should follow up on later?
SNP a coding tool like a way to, I'm not familiar with that. I don't know
Okay.
if that is, I would recommend the person contact me offline and I'll make sure I respond, but I'm not familiar with that. We didn't touch on math because this workshop is literacy, but there are tools that will read math notation and math ML and let you dictate math. So if SNP is it's a way to copy a text. Yeah, let's take that offline and I will try to do a little research and help with that, but I don't know off the top of my head.
And this is great modeling too. I know that I always feel like comforted when somebody who thinks about technology and accessibility all day long, right, doesn't know something and says, "I'll do some research." And that really, I think, is that last piece that we want to give folks before we close this afternoon, which is, and maybe you can advance that slide. I think it's coming up right in a moment. Is that literacy learning designers do not need to be accessibility experts themselves. They need to consider accessibility. That's like the law, right? That's the responsibility of being a learning designer. And they need to reach out for the expertise of others. So just like I might call you on a Monday afternoon and say, I'm going to do this thing, right? Or you might do some research on something that you don't know. We all need to be able to access the expertise of others, but it's that habit of mind and that commitment, right? That commitment to accessible learning design, not putting that barrier in front of learners, but giving learners access to that goal and access to all of the expert learning skills that they can learn on their journey toward that goal. I see that Jennifer is putting in the chat that there's an evaluation. So I'll just say that aloud so folks that aren't opening the chat know that there is a link to how did you like this today, an evaluation. But I'll turn it back over to you, Janet, to introduce this wonderful resource of the AIM Cafe.
Yes. And to follow up, yes, I see that my name and email is in the chat. Please reach out to me. And I do now understand your question better. And I do have an answer but to model for Susan, anyone who works in technology should never say they know everything because that's impossible. So definitely, no matter what your field, you always need to do research, right? That is just the reality. And this is one way to support that as you're learning these skills and practicing these skills, which I would recommend you take some of what you've learned today and go to your operating system and see if you can do some of the features or design a document and see if it comes out accessibly. At the National AIM Center, we have what's called the AIM Cafe. It's really fun. We've just started it. It's an informal way to come and bring a question or bring a resource you want to share. We usually have a theme of the month. And there's just a few of us who work at CAST who act as baristas. And we have chat time and share resources and help each other resolve questions that we might have. So the next one coming up is February 4th. That's at 4:00 Eastern time. I'm sorry, you need to do the back to Pacific time for you, but it's open. You do need to register. You register one time and then you're registered for every monthly cafe and you can show up when you want to show up. So I wanted to make sure you knew about that resource and encourage you to come with any questions as you are exploring that.
And then as we close, I see that it's just about the top of the hour. If you're willing and able to share any next steps that you've thought about as you've been here for this last hour, is there a habit that you might want to develop for considering accessibility, writing it at the top of your lesson plan book, accessibility, or what might you do to build that habit of mind so that just as I used to do, like, oh yeah, accessibility at the end of my learning design, that we really bring it right into the every step of that learning design, not just the beginning, but every step along the way. Or maybe you have a next step that's related to learning more about some tool or technology that you heard mentioned today. You want to find out about that strategy. You're going to go to that AIM Cafe. What might you do? And we ask you to put those next steps in the chat, because I know sometimes that someone else's next step can be an inspiration for mine. So feel free, let's take a moment to do that before you go. And I just want to say a big public thank you, Janet, for joining us. This is an exciting webinar series. It's really a challenging time to be thinking about literacy instruction when we're teaching in buildings and teaching online and back in buildings. And so we really appreciate you being here. So a big thank you. Anybody want to share next steps in the chat? You have an evaluation, and I think that's the last slide, right? Everyone knows this moment that I'm having where you think, is there anything else? Next session, that's right, thank you.
Just the next session.
So the next session is going to be thinking about engagement. How do learners, how do expert literacy learners become interested? How do they sustain their interest and their effort and their resilience during learning, especially during a time when learning may be more challenging and I have to be more self-directed and sustain my own persistence a little bit more in a hybrid model? And how do learners self-regulate? We're hearing so much about that emotional well-being of learners being a #1 concern of educators. So our next session will be about engaging literacy learners. So we hope to see you on February 8th. Just a reminder, these are all recorded. And so in the doc that Neil and Jennifer posted 100 times, you'll see the recordings for the first webinar, and in a couple of days you'll see the recording for this one. So if you missed one, you have access there. We'll stick around for a couple of minutes, but without further ado, just thank you and have a pleasant evening, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.